In honor of Season 4 coming out in a couple of weeks, I ultimately decided to finally release this video I have been tinkering with for a while on Cobra Kai. I watched it a couple of months ago, and before then, I had heard so many great things about it, and was very excited to watch it. Unlike, say, Bly Manor, Cobra Kai still managed to exceed my expectations despite the fact that they were already very high. I won't be talking too much about the quality of the show, because what I think about the show seems like a given with how excited I am talking about the subject. For this video, I'll just be talking about the main idea as to why Cobra Kai is as good as it is, and why it works with this certain subject I want to talk about. I think Cobra Kai was sort of this perfect storm of quality, and how it manages to do everything right with the concept of legacy and passing the torch, as it says in the title of this video. Stargirl almost got to that point, but when you're killing the entirety of the first generation in the opening minutes of the first episode, that idea will remain somewhat tainted. Even though it is a surprisingly great show, as well as the end of Season 2 sort of implying that passing the torch type of thing. Another great example is the recent Ghostbusters Afterlife. It perfectly conveys the power of legacy as well, but I might do a whole nother video on that. Let's stick to Cobra Kai. Cobra Kai manages to perfectly articulate the importance of every generation in regards to this universe. The first generation of Mr. Miyagi and Kreese, the second generation with Daniel and Johnny, and finally the third generation of Miguel, Sam, and all the other supporting characters of their respective dojos. How every lesson that was taught in the original trilogy bleeds down from one generation to the next, good and bad, and the consequences of each action. While this may seem like very simple storytelling, it's surprising how so many people seem to forget this. But let's break it down as to why this works and the methods it conveys in regards to both sides. In many franchises nowadays, there is sort of this need to make it constantly seem fresh and new, all the time. Now, that isn't totally a bad thing when it comes to newer franchises or original films. But when it comes to franchises that have been around since forever, there needs to be a perfect balance of old and new, and it is supremely difficult to get those ideas conveyed and executed properly. And when it comes to the range of difficulty, executives, producers, and higher-ups want that range to be at the very bottom, so they ultimately decide to ditch all the old fans, with the exception of nostalgia baiting and pandering in a very corporate and emotionless way, and only try to sell to the new fans. This has happened with continuations and reboots in so many franchises. Doctor Who, Star Trek, Star Wars, and the Ghostbusters remake specifically being the most popular low-hanging fruit in regards to franchises with higher-ups that simply don't seem to care about their older fans. Doctor Who and Star Trek breaking 50+ years of canon for shit that doesn't make sense, Disney being incapable of making a good Star Wars movie, and Paul Feig being a terrible filmmaker. However, with Afterlife, the latter got rectified, as I mentioned. Now, not all is lost, as there are some franchises that actually seem to give a shit about their fans. Jumanji being a somewhat decent example, as well as Superman and Lois actually giving a shit about the Superman mythos and respecting the Superman character while also trying to do something new. Halloween is also a decent example as well, even with the most recent addition to the franchise. But all of those franchises manage to have some flaws with passing the torch to the next generation. Cobra Kai is one that manages to know what it wants to do, and it does so near flawlessly. With the biggest reason being, nobody gives a fuck about the Karate Kid franchise. It is a franchise nobody cared about on initially a streaming service nobody cared about. So it had the freedom, in a way, to tell a great story with major respect to old and new alike, as well as people behind the camera who genuinely cared about the franchise, as well as bringing all the actors back to do their respected roles. Now, actually going back to what I was saying about every generation being worked into the show properly, here's how it is. You have the generation farthest back, the teachers. Mr. Miyagi's influence throughout the show is felt, despite Pat Morita unfortunately no longer being with us. They make sure to reference him and his teachings throughout the show to make sure his presence is felt, that he is integral to the overall narrative. I think there is a bit too much telling and not showing, but I will forgive that purely because it manages to do so many other things so incredibly well as showcasing that Miyagi isn't the be-all and end-all and that he was only human as well and had flaws. Then on the other side, you have Kreese. They managed to implement more shades of gray into his character in Season 3. I do think it was kind of effective how Kreese was the product of his environment becoming the way that he did. While his actions are obviously not condonable and how he was warped into a barely human man, he did start out as someone who was just like everyone else, dealing with the same issues as everyone else. But thanks to the dehumanizing effects of war and various decisions during said war, he became the feared warrior of Cobra Kai. While I wasn't the biggest fan of the flashbacks, as I found the main story a little bit more interesting, they were still intriguing to watch unfold. So, there was a certain amount of respect towards each person of that first generation, making sure Miyagi is felt but showing he was flawed, and Kreese not being the totally evil man that we see him as, and how he was shaped to become the way that he is. Then you have the second generation, which is my personal favorite out of the three. How they managed to completely and utterly overhaul Johnny Lawrence as a character was very satisfying. While he's not perfect and still kind of an idiot, there is still actual character development there, which is also something that not a lot of franchise writers seem to get. Not everyone starts out perfect, stays perfect, and doesn't learn anything. Despite Johnny not being the brightest bulb ever, he still sees how he is potentially harming these kids and becoming just like Kreese towards the end of Season 1, and then trying his hardest to not become like that, but with that shade of gray mentality that Cobra Kai loves to showcase, and for good reason. Those decisions have consequences, and despite being good intentions, it still resulted in Miguel almost being paralyzed. Johnny is trying so hard not to damage the kids he's teaching, but since he didn't have that guiding light of someone like Miyagi, he doesn't know how to really do that, but has that strive to be better, which is very much constant after Season 1 with how Miguel defeats Robbie. Then on the other side, you have Daniel, whose development isn't as noticeable as Johnny is more of a flawed character, but I do like what the show did with Daniel anyway. How despite having everything and having Miyagi's advice, he still struggles trying to deal with everything going on in his life, when Cobra Kai does enter his life again. And since he doesn't have that guiding light anymore, he is always trying to deal with the situations that life throws at him, Cobra Kai or not. He has someone like Amanda, who is easily my favorite character since she points out all the bullshit regarding this rivalry. She's there to essentially ground him to reality, and how Daniel has to, in a way, move on from Miyagi to be his own man and deal with his own problems his way. While Miyagi will always be there in spirit to help guide him, I feel as though that Daniel is becoming his own man again, after everything that's happened, you know? Then finally, you have the third generation with the many different characters, although mainly the trifecta of Miguel, Robbie, and Sam. I know some fans who don't really like the stuff with the newer generation, mainly because many feel it was more incorporated because it was originally a YouTube Red / premium show. But I find the newer generation stuff to be just as interesting, mainly because it's so important with how each ideology of Miyagi and Kreese trickle down into everyone and how each person or generation warps those ideals, for better or for worse. Different people try to improve upon them or twist them in some way to make them even worse than they are, kind of like in the Season 4 trailer with Robbie teaching wax on, wax off in Cobra Kai. Definitely a scary moment. While the romantic subplots are a bit cheesy at times, I think the characters themselves are so well written and so well executed, it's a very, very small nitpick that I'm willing to overlook. So not only do they manage to respect every generation in the right ways, but the greatest attribute they have, even more so than the power of legacy in every generation, but they simply tell a great story with well-written characters. While it does seem that the jumping off point is miscommunication and valor, the way that the show works around that to give us a story that holds true to the original film's underdog tale, while also twisting it and showing those morally gray areas to every conflict in the show is truly brilliant. How it takes the cliches of 80s movies and tries to either twist them, improve upon them, or modernize them, but not in a bad, pandery sort of way. With all of this though, what am I trying to get at? Well, when it comes to many other franchises, they seem to be afraid of giving the appropriate respect to what came before and only focus on the new. Very few franchises seem to care about the past despite being reliant on the past to sell their product, despite more often than not disrespecting the fans that came before. And then they wonder why their new product failed. With Cobra Kai, what it does is that it pays attention to everyone equally, showcasing what came way before and how those consequences affect them, as well as the now. While it does seem that they're milking it with a season 5, I hope that they can take advantage of every story opportunity that you can possibly do on this show and respect every single person and generation. On top of that, and rather simply, they're telling a good story. Well, which is also something that many people seem to forget. They rely on so much corporate nostalgia baiting to disguise the fact that they can't write a good story, that everything falls apart if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. But Cobra Kai, despite a bit of milking a good thing on Netflix's part, seems to be telling a story with a beginning, a middle, and end. And with that, in this day and age, it's really fucking commendable.